Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I'm extremely pleased to have as my guest today Eva Golinger. Eva is an attorney specializing in immigration and international law and the author of the best-selling book, The Chavez Code. Eva was a close personal friend and advisor to former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. Eva Golinger's new book is Confidente of Tyrants, the insider story of the American woman trusted by the U.S.'s biggest enemy. I talked with Eva via Skype on January 31st. For people that are listening to mainstream media in the U.S. currently, and we've been hearing a lot about the desperate situation in Venezuela for years, even before our president decided to choose a president for Venezuela. How much of the economic, political, social malaise that we hear about is actually happening and is the result of missteps or corruption in the Maduro administration, and how much of it is just propaganda from the West?
So Venezuela, like many countries in Latin America, has experienced an economic recession or crisis over the past few years. That was really region-wide due to a drop in oil prices that took place. There's a lot of countries in the region that have, oil and other strategic resources. So that affected like Ecuador as well, and even Brazil, Argentina. For different reasons in those countries, but related to the global economy that was experiencing on ups and downs. In any case, so in Venezuela, throughout the Chavez administration, and really there was a period that was referred to more as sort of the golden years, when things were really prospering in terms of not just the income coming in from the oil sales, but also his government was diversifying the economy, or attempting to, and making new trade deals and really investing in infrastructure and social programs, but in many ways was overspending, because there was most of the income coming in was in fact from oil. And as the price fluctuated and the public spending continued to increase, debt was created. So that even though it's an interesting factor, because Chavez actually paid off Venezuela's debt entirely to the World Bank and the IMF, and pulled Venezuela out of both institutions. And so there was a period of time where Venezuela did not have any external debt whatsoever. But what happened was, as the spending grew to finance all these incredible programs that were being implemented by the state, and the state apparatus itself began to really expand exponentially. At one stage during his presidency, there were like 27 ministries. They had more than doubled. That in turn created hundreds of thousands of jobs really throughout the country. And they had all these social missions, which were essentially the social programs like healthcare and education at all the different levels, starting from pre-K up through higher education, job training programs, cultural programs, all kinds of things that the state was funding through these different programs that then were employing people to work in them. What happened was that there was so much spending, even though the result was eradication of poverty, increase of overall quality of life, also expansion of the infrastructure, modernization throughout the country, and also millions of homes and apartments, and were built by the government, subsidized food markets that were supplying communities nationwide. And again, as I was saying, the healthcare wasn't just hospitals and clinics, but also in the neighborhoods, in poorer neighborhoods, local clinics were set up and staffed by doctors. So, there were just huge quality impacts to people's lives. All of that was very positive, but and it ended up being that Venezuela was not taking in enough income, because it was also, as it diversified its trade partners, the deals became different. For example, when it needed money, it was trading oil to China initially for loans from China. So it wasn't getting currency coming in. It had money that was already being used. but Venezuela had to pay it off through loans. Or with Cuba, it was sending oil, but it was getting paid in social services like doctors to staff all the new clinics throughout the country. So Venezuela's main source of actual liquid income has always been, continues to be, which is why the sanctions the U.S. is imposing now are devastating. The main source of actual liquid currency has always been from the United States and the oil that Venezuela sells to the United States. So, in a long story short, because it is a long story, when Chavez fell ill in 2011, things started to go down economically and the oil prices were falling. And so therefore they weren't taking in as much money. The debt was growing. They were then taking loans in addition to from China as well as from Russia. And so Venezuela just wasn't getting a lot of money in. There was a currency crisis because of the fact that they didn't have as much access to actual dollars. The dollar became overvalued in terms of Venezuela's national currency, the bolivar. And so there became this parallel black market, and that just exploded everything and led to this hyperinflation that today is just outrageous. Then there became this sort of divided economic society in Venezuela where those who had access to foreign currency had purchasing powers and those that didn't, fell into poverty, even though they had been living fairly well up until then. And then what happened was when Chavez was ill, the decisions that needed to be made were not made. And then Venezuela went through this period of uncertainty, mourning when he died. And then from the time that Nicolas Maduro was first elected after Chavez's death in April of 2013, his first election, his legitimacy was disputed by the opposition. They never accepted him as a legitimate president. So the country was in constant chaos and destabilization with protests. In the end, what does that mean in terms of everyday lives of Venezuelans? Yes, there are widespread shortages of products. Today, there are lines for food and for gas, for example, which is crazy because it's an oil and gas producing country that are can extend for days. In fact, I mean, those types of scenarios are not the same Venezuela that I knew just a few years ago. But at the same time, people are still functioning. I mean, it's not like the media projects, you would think everybody is just like nothing can function. But the truth is that people still go to restaurants. They're still going out at night to bars. They're still going to their jobs. I mean, they're using the metro and public transportation and driving. And I mean, they're still living their everyday lives. So yes, they are in a crisis. Large part is due to the poor economic decisions, the overdependency on the oil income, the massive public spending. But once the U.S. began to impose targeted sanctions, first started with Obama, but Trump really increased it, and now has really doubled down to cripple and strangle the Maduro government. Now it's having a dramatic impact, and that, of course, that's the goal: is to put so much pressure on that he'll resign.
Mm-hmm. It's the same tactic, actually, that I believe Kissinger used on Chile.
Make the economy scream.
Make the economy scream, exactly. And one other factor, I know when you first met President Hugo Chavez, after investigating the extent of U.S. support for not only the coup against him in 2002, but the opposition that currently and still is funded by the U.S., it would seem to me that probably the funding and the support of opposition groups by the United States through National Endowment for Democracy and other organizations has continued and probably increased since the election of Maduro. Is that true?
I would say, yes, it is true. It's hard to say where exactly the money is going because after I had been doing that work for a while and not just requesting documents under Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, but also publishing the results, and they became very impacting in Venezuela. The U.S. government, through those agencies, USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, began withholding the names of the groups that they fund, which really should be illegal because we should know where our taxpayer dollars are going. Those are publicly funded organizations. They are using our hard-earned money to fund these groups that are attempting to overthrow governments and install regimes favorable to the U.S. and actually in countries around the world. But in the case of Venezuela, yes. I mean, certainly over the past few years, there's been an increase in that funding. I mean, it's outlined every year in the State Department budget. in the foreign operations budget. I believe that for this past year, it was around $20 million, which may not sound like a lot. That's an enormous amount of money in Venezuela. And especially because most of it is going to these shell organizations that just channel it into anti-government groups. So essentially it feeds the conflict. And there was one point, I remember a document that actually I didn't obtain under FOIA, but rather WikiLeaks released in their 2010 State Department cables. There was one where the acting ambassador at the time, I believe it was in Caracas, or whoever was highest up in the embassy at the time, because I don't think they had ambassadors anymore. But he said specifically that were it not for the funding that USAID and NED were giving to the opposition groups in Venezuela, they would cease to exist. That really says it all. Essentially, the U.S. has been propping up this opposition. It's not to say that everyone in Venezuela would want Maduro as their president if it weren't for U.S. funding to the opposition or support. But essentially, we have to look at who are those in the leadership of the opposition and that have been fueling this ongoing campaign of regime change, because it's been going on for many years. It was going on all through Chavez's presidency and has just increased under Maduro because they see an opportunity. He's much more vulnerable. He's not as popular. And now, of course, we see it's come to this head where now it looks like it's a point of no return, essentially, that neither side is going to budge. And so therefore, whichever side is stronger is the one that's going to crush the other one. And it looks like it's going to be, Trump backing the opposition. Hard to imagine them backing down. But I think it's important to see that what Venezuela's sovereignty and right to self-determination has been substantially violated by the United States through this funding of shell NGOs and political parties and other groups in the country, because essentially it's been imposing for years through a more of a slower, meticulous process and influencing their political agenda. And going into infiltrating neighborhoods that were bastions of support for Chavez and the government, and sowing discontent. It's a mix, because some of that discontent, of course, is real, but these have encouraged it. So that's played a very key role in debilitating the grassroots community-based support for the government.
It's not just Venezuela, of course, that these groups are active in. Should the Venezuelan government have done more, or could they have done more to curtail this support, identify the groups that were receiving support from the U.S. State Department?
Yes. I talk about that actually in my new book, in Confidente of Tyrants, that in fact I helped write legislation specifically that was based on U.S. legislation, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, that prohibits that type of foreign political influence in the United States. And so it only seemed just that other countries would have the option of doing the same instead of it being imposed on them. So for a while, it was called the Golinger Law in Venezuela, but of course, because they passed the law, but it was never, ever implemented, ever, not even one time. It's hard for me to understand whether or not it was incompetence or just overall indifference. There was always rhetoric and discourse out of, the pro-government forces in the legislative body, the National Assembly, as well as the president himself, criticizing and denouncing that type of interference, and those that accepted that money from, U.S. entities in order to try to impose regime change or just undermine the government in general. But they never actually implemented or enforced the laws that they had to control that. Everybody knew who was getting the money. And in fact, many times it was in the open because they had to report it, even though National Endowment for Democracy or USAID would refuse to disclose who exactly they were funding. They still had to disclose what they were funding. So they would disclose every year, the description of the projects or programs or organizations they were funding. And everybody in the political sphere, who's who. So it was easy to figure out who's doing this project, this program, that's the one getting the money. The problem is that the State Department, the United States State Department, through these entities like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, has essentially co-opted the concept of nonprofits and human rights work to use them to promote their own agenda in other countries. How can you be a non-governmental organization when your funding is coming from a foreign government that is pushing its agenda through your organization? That should be disclosed in terms of the work that you're doing, because that it wasn't just that they got the money and could do whatever they want with it. They had to report back on what they were doing, and they were getting payments for that work. So it had to align with U.S. interests. And in fact, there was a court case that I pursued to try to get the names of the groups revealed after they started withholding them. And the argument was that, no, these are agents of the United States. We have to protect them. So then there you have it again. I mean, and so it seemed as though, imagine the reverse. Look at in this country how worked up so many people are over, this alleged Russian interference. Well, that is precisely what the United States has been doing in Venezuela and in other countries for years. I mean, and that's it's gone to undermine their democracy and the will of the people in that country, and to interfere in their electoral process. And now look what's going on. We've got it's open and explicit, where there's just, they're not hiding anything or covering it up. They're directly saying this is a regime change operation. The only solution to the current situation is that Maduro's government is gone. And this one that Trump has recognized, is the president of Venezuela. So, I mean, it's not even a clandestine operation. It's completely overt.
Not. Who is Juan Guaido? Who does he actually represent? I mean, besides the U.S. government,
So he's a young political face. It was very fortunate of the opposition that they were able to find someone who would be charismatic enough and brave enough, really courageous, to take on this role, because it is. Of course, his life is in danger. And he has so far, although I've already seen that there are all kinds of things behind the scene going on with the opposition in Venezuela, that they're not all in agreement that he should be the figurehead. Because one thing a lot of times people don't know, because we say the opposition or anti-government groups, but in Venezuela, that opposition is comprised of over a dozen different political parties, all with different agendas, all with their own leadership that all want to be president. And also from different spectrums. Some are on the left and some are center and some are right. Juan Guaido comes from the far right-wing party that was an offshoot of his party is called Voluntad Popular, which is popular will. And his party is an offshoot of Primero Justicia, First Justice, which is actually a political party in Venezuela that was created by a U.S. organization known as the International Republican Institute that used to be headed by John McCain. It's one of the four core groups that was created with the National Endowment for Democracy in the early 1980s. And its sole purpose is to fund political parties around the world that are allied with the more conservative agenda of the Republicans in the United States. They've had a major role in colored revolutions in Eastern Europe, for example, working against communism and socialism and all that kind of stuff. So Juan Guaido comes from that political history, but he's young. I think he's only about in his mid to late 30s. He was active in the student movement. He was active in 2007 in the student movement. So he was a university student in 2007 that rose up against Chavez in these very violent protests known as the Guarimbas, which were essentially street protests using Molotov cocktails and rocks and other weaponry. And they essentially set up violent demonstrations throughout the country in an attempt to, at that time, it was stop a constitutional reform that Chavez was pushing through the Congress, the National Assembly. And so, and also through a referendum in the country. And they actually were successful in that initiative in the sense that the referendum was not approved. And so that movement gained steam. But that movement in itself has its roots also in a lot of U.S. Government organizations funded through National Endowment for Democracy and USAID that were working with a lot of those student leaders. And so Guaido is from that group. And he's also mentored by Leopoldo Lopez, who was the face of more of the extremist right-wing opposition, who became the darling also of the international community and here in the US, because he's someone, he went to Harvard. I mean, And the same with Guaido. He was educated in the United States. These guys all come from more wealthier backgrounds and have privileged access to resources than your average Venezuelan. So even though he wasn't a well-known face in the country, he has been deeply involved in the anti-government movement from at least a little more than a decade ago, and has consistently engaged in undemocratic actions in an attempt to overthrow or destabilize the government. So that's his background. So doesn't discount. Right now, he's completely legitimate. He was elected as a legislator in 2015 under the same electoral process that Nicolas Maduro was elected as president, which means if Maduro is illegitimate, then maybe so is Guaido. And then just this past January 4th, he was when the legislative year started again, Guaido was elected as the president of the National Assembly, which is Venezuela's legislative body. When Maduro was sworn in for his second term on January 10th, and you see the two branches of government don't recognize each other. So there's been a standoff for several years now. But when Maduro was inaugurated to a second term, January 10th, what happened was the legislative body, which is a majority opposition, said they weren't recognizing his second term because they had boycotted the past elections and declared them illegitimate. And so Guaido invoked the powers under the Constitution to declare that there was a vacancy in the executive branch, and therefore, as the president of the legislative branch, he would then assume the interim powers and convene elections within the stipulated time period, which is supposed to be 30 days. So, but there are some divisions I wanted to just mention because that have been coming out. There are some in the opposition who are saying, okay, if he doesn't get the election set up in 30 days, we're not going to back him anymore. So, it's not as though this is some solidified group working to oust Maduro.
The fact that he's from the far right opposition, it reminds me of situations like that of Bolsonaro now in Brazil. We have Brazil and Argentina and Ecuador, where we have governments that were essentially left-wing governments overthrown and replaced by far-right governments. Do you think this trend can be stopped?
You never know with Venezuela. Venezuela is a very unpredictable place, but the Maduro has done a very bad job. And it's not only the economy, it's his manner of governing as the president. He has been very sectarian. He's been completely unaccepting of any kind of criticism. Anyone who's been critical from within, Chavismo or his base of support, they're labeled traitors or expelled from the party, the government party, the PSUV, the Socialist United Party of Venezuela. So there's been a growing group of what they call our dissenters from within Chavismo. A lot of former members of Chavez's government are absolutely opposed to Maduro. The corruption has just expanded rampantly. Maduro is directly involved in many, corrupt schemes, and so is his wife, who's very much controls with him as sort of a duo government. And so there are a lot of concerns in that sense that people would rather have somebody else, but there's a crisis of leadership in Venezuela. And part of that is because any alternatives to, Maduro have been crushed by Maduro and his people. And there are some of them who are in prison and who they've tried to neutralize as challengers, even though they'd be from the same side. But here's what I believe. This is the first time we're seeing this kind of overt and very aggressive and, explicit that's it. The end game is here. Maduro has to go. The U.S. is talking. Trump himself and all his high level officials are talking about a military operation. There's been a buildup recently in Colombia. I've been seeing some who are monitoring arrivals and departures of all kinds of U.S. military planes into Colombia. So I do believe that they have a military plan that's already in motion. And the problem comes down to the fact that Maduro is digging in deeper. He is showing no signs whatsoever of considering that he would step down. If they do some kind of military op and take out Maduro and those in his inner circle, and then the opposition takes power, then we're going to see a repetition of what happened in 2002 in the coup against Chavez, when they briefly ousted him. They were backed by the military. They were backed by the U.S. They took power. They dissolved all of Venezuela's institutions, Venezuela's democracy. The constitution was thrown in the garbage and essentially installed a dictatorship, and killed a bunch of Chavez supporters and took repressive action. So the fear is that if there's not some kind of negotiated solution where there can be some type of transitory government, so there has to be give and take on both sides. There must be compromise. And at this stage, most Venezuelans feel as though it's Maduro. He's the problem here. Those that have supported Chavismo traditionally don't want to just lose everything. Right. And nor should they have to. It's millions of people. So there needs to be, otherwise, all of that Chavismo and the movement and the legacy and the achievements, even though some have already been rolled back, all of it will be destroyed. Right. And so the only way out of this is if essentially he sacrifices himself by stepping down and allowing for there to be, some kind of transitional entity with representatives from all sides that would work towards an electoral process where Venezuelans would get to decide who their leader is and not Donald Trump. Mexico and Uruguay, who are neutral, have already proposed on February 7th an international conference in, I believe it's in Uruguay, and they've invited UN, they've invited the European Union, they've invited, all Latin American nations and anyone else to participate. To try to come up with a peaceful resolution to Venezuela's crisis. So there are those who, and the Pope, they want the Pope to participate. There are those who are interested in finding that type of a solution for Venezuela. But the problem comes down to the fact that I believe that the White House has already made its mind up. And Maduro is not stepping down. And at this stage, if somebody doesn't get his ear, who says, you have to, for the sake of our nation, and you must, and so that we don't lose everything we've achieved. If somebody sensible can't capture his attention to say that, and if he won't listen, then this could escalate into a violent confrontation.
One thing about Trump and the policy, and I know you've had a lot of negative things to say about Trump, as have I, is that the policy is very crude and blatant at this point, outrageous. I mean, there's just absolutely no respect whatsoever for international law. And now, allies of the United States basically have to either go along with these outrageous things, or they'll incur the wrath of the government and there will be sanctions. It seems like it's almost the last throes of the empire or something. It really seems that this puts all the rest of the nations in the world in a really difficult position.
It looks as though Trump has decided that Venezuela is an easy target and that it's a bipartisan issue, because even though there's some criticism coming out from the Democrats regarding any type of military operation, they all seem to generally be in agreement that the U.S. government should be pursuing a path that would enable Maduro's departure from government. And they've all recognized Juan Guiado as being some type of legitimate fill-in for the president. So I think that, in that way there's backing, but certainly, I mean, there is a question of, well, what type of situation would take place? And now the fact that they've been so overt in their consideration of a possible military operation, if some kind of covert op occurs now, everybody's going to know that it was the U.S. because he's already openly discussed it. But in order to engage in some type of military action, under the law, he would need congressional approval, and he would not get that. There's no question that they would give approval to go to war against Venezuela. But I do think that there's multiple factors. It has nothing to do with ideology whatsoever, or whether there's socialism or not in Venezuela. It has to do with Venezuela's oil. And so I believe that, that's the key here. And Trump is seeing it in the sense of dollars in profit. If they can go in and gain control and install U.S. operation companies in charge of Venezuela's oil resources, that will be a tremendous benefit to the U.S. economy. So and he wants to build the Trump Tower Caracas.
Make America great. Well, Eva, thanks very, very, very much for taking the time with me today. I really appreciate it. I mean, this has been very enlightening. There's so much bad information coming out about what's going on in Venezuela. It's great to have the real story. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.